The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound like a gavel. An elderly man in a worn gray suit stood before the bench, adjusting his glasses with trembling hands. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "Professor Allen, do you understand the gravity of these charges? Fraud, falsifying research, public deception? You could lose everything." The old man looked up slowly. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I didn't come here to defend my reputation. I came here to defend the truth." A ripple of whispers swept across the room. Reporters leaned forward. The nation's once beloved scientist now stood accused of betraying the very world he had tried to change. The judge frowned. "You mean to tell me you're representing yourself? No attorney?" The professor gave a tired smile. "No lawyer can explain the evidence better than the man who created it." For a brief moment, even the judge fell silent, unsure whether to feel pity or anger. "Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Sweet Justice, where every verdict has a heart and every story finds its truth." The hum of the ceiling fans echoed softly against the marble walls. Sunlight spilled through the tall courthouse windows, bouncing off the polished wood of the judge's bench. The tension in the room felt thick enough to hold. Judge Marcus Reynolds adjusted his robe and glanced down at the old man standing before him. His expression wasn't of hostility but of curiosity, the kind reserved for a man who's lived long enough to have seen both miracles and madness. The retired Professor Samuel Allen, a name once spoken with admiration in the halls of universities, now stood alone, accused of manipulating data that had once won him global acclaim. The court clerk called out, "Case number 422B, the state versus Professor Samuel Allen." A few journalists shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. The headline they were hoping for was obvious: "Fallen genius finally exposed." But the professor wasn't trembling from fear. He was trembling because he hadn't slept in 3 days. His frail hands gripped the lectern, his knuckles white. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. "Professor Allen, the prosecution claims you intentionally falsified climate research data that influenced national policy. Do you wish to make an opening statement?" The professor's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." He looked around the room. His eyes met those of his former students, colleagues, and the reporters who once celebrated him. "I spent 45 years studying the Earth," he began. 45 years measuring winds, ice, oceans, and everything in between. My work wasn't just data, it was my life. But now they say I lied, because my truth made powerful men uncomfortable. Whispers spread again like wildfire. The prosecutor, a young ambitious man named Daniel Cross, smirked slightly and stepped forward. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making emotional appeals rather than addressing the charges." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled. I'll allow it, for now. I want to hear where this goes." The professor nodded in gratitude, then took a slow breath. 3 years ago, my research predicted that a certain coastal region, belonging to a major real estate investor, would become uninhabitable within a decade due to rising sea levels. That same investor is the one funding the campaign to destroy my credibility. He paused, letting the silence do the work. Cross frowned. "That's a serious accusation, Professor. Do you have proof of this alleged influence?" The professor lifted a stack of letters from his briefcase. "These are internal emails between that investor's company and government officials who conveniently lost my funding after I refused to alter the data." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Proceed, Professor," the old man continued, his voice steadier now. "They accused me of falsifying records, but in reality I was pressured to change them. I refused. And when I refused, they made me their villain." Judge Reynolds tapped his pen against the table. "So you're suggesting that this case is politically motivated?" "I'm not suggesting, Your Honor," the professor replied quietly. "I'm stating it." Cross stepped in again, his tone sharp. "Your Honor, this is speculation. None of these documents have been verified." The professor handed them to the bailiff. "Then verify them. Every line, every timestamp, every digital trace, and I have backups of everything. I may be old, but I didn't forget how to secure my life's work." Judge Reynolds looked toward Cross. "Mr. Prosecutor, perhaps you should refrain from interrupting until we've reviewed these." Cross clenched his jaw and stepped back. The courtroom murmured again. For years, the world had seen Professor Allen as a symbol of truth and progress. until a sudden wave of accusations turned him into a national disgrace. Now he stood before a judge with nothing but his evidence and his dignity. A woman sitting in the gallery dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She was one of Alan's former assistants. She knew what the world didn't, that he'd refused countless bribes and grants because he believed science shouldn't serve money. Judge Reynolds watched the old man carefully. "Professor, I will personally review these documents, but I need to ask, why did you decide to defend yourself instead of hiring counsel?" The professor smiled faintly. "Because, Your Honor, no lawyer believes in lost causes anymore." For a moment, even the judge looked taken aback. The professor went on. "If I must fall, I'd rather fall telling the truth, not hiding behind legal language." A deep hush settled in the room. The prosecutor shifted uneasily. Something about this man, his composure, his conviction, felt too real to dismiss as strategy. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "You seem to have given this a lot of thought. But you understand, Professor, that the law doesn't care about emotion. It cares about proof." The professor met his gaze. "Then you'll have all the proof you need, Your Honor." He reached into his briefcase again and produced a small flash drive. On this drive is a recording, an uncut meeting between me and the investor's legal team where they offered me $10 million to retract my findings. The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters stood, cameras flashing. Judge Reynolds banged the gavel. "Order, order!" When the room fell silent, the professor added quietly, "The world wanted to believe I was a liar because it's easier than believing that the truth is for sale." Cross whispered to his assistant, visibly nervous now. "There's no way he has that recording." But the look on the professor's face said otherwise. As the hearing took a brief recess, the professor walked toward the window. The late morning light fell across his weary face. For the first time in months, he felt a sliver of peace. A reporter approached him cautiously. "Professor Allen, do you think the truth will really save you?" He turned, his eyes distant. The truth never saves anyone. It just exposes who we really are. He looked at the courtroom door, the place where his entire life was being judged. "But maybe if it saves someone else from what I went through, it's enough." The reporter hesitated, then asked, "Why do this now? Why not stay silent like everyone else?" Allen smiled sadly. "Because silence is how we all became complicit." When court resumed, Judge Reynolds spoke firmly. "We've reviewed the initial metadata from these emails and they appear legitimate. Mr. Cross, I suggest you reconsider your position before we proceed." Cross swallowed hard. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to confer with my team." "Denied," the judge said sharply. "We'll continue." The professor stood still, hands clasped as if waiting for permission to breathe. The judge's tone softened slightly. "Professor Allen, I want you to tell this court, Jan, in your own words, what happened the day your research was published." The old man nodded slowly. "That day was supposed to be the proudest of my life. My team had finally proven a link between oceanic methane release and industrial waste dumping. It could have changed policy, maybe saved lives. But within 24 hours, my funding was cut, my lab was raided, and the media branded me a fraud. I lost my reputation overnight." He looked up at the judge with tired eyes. "And when I demanded to know why, I was told the truth was bad for business." Gasps rippled through the courtroom once again. Judge Reynolds sat in silence, absorbing every word. He had seen liars, manipulators, and opportunists, but there was something hauntingly sincere about this man, something that made him question whether justice itself had lost its way. The professor continued softly, almost like confessing to the wind. "I spent my life teaching students to seek truth, and even when it hurts. Now I stand here accused for practicing what I preached." He looked toward the jury. "You don't have to believe me. Just believe the evidence. Because when I'm gone, the truth will still be here. It always outlives the liars." The courtroom fell into utter silence. Even the air seemed to pause. Judge Reynolds took off his glasses and sighed. "We'll adjourn for the day." As the professor gathered his papers, his hand trembled. He wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or relief that at last someone had listened. That night, Judge Reynolds sat alone in his chambers, reviewing the files. The emails, the timestamps, the uncut recording, every detail matched. Every threat, every transaction. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "What have we done?" he whispered to himself. For the first time in his career, The judge felt shame, and not for what he'd done, but for what the system had become. Outside, thunder rolled across the night sky, rattling the old courthouse windows. Inside, a truth too heavy to ignore had finally begun to surface. The next morning, the courthouse was packed before dawn. Camera crews lined the steps outside, flashing lights reflecting off the courthouse pillars. Inside, journalists murmured over coffee cups, flipping through their notes. Everyone knew this was no longer a simple case about falsified data. This was about power. Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom precisely at 9. Court is now in session. Professor Allen was already standing at the defense table, papers neatly arranged, his gray hair combed back. But his face looked even paler today, a soft tremor in his hands as he adjusted his glasses. Prosecutor Daniel Cross rose slowly, the confident smirk from yesterday now replaced with a forced calm. Your Honor, after reviewing the materials presented by the defendant, the state requests time to authenticate the recordings before they are presented to the jury. Judge Reynolds glanced at him sharply. You had the entire night, Mr. Cross. Are you suggesting the state is unprepared? Cross swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, only cautious. Caution, the judge replied dryly, isn't the same as delay. He turned toward Professor Allen. You may proceed. The old man nodded and placed a small speaker on the table. He inserted the flash drive, pressed play, and the room filled with the chillingly calm voice of a corporate lawyer. Professor Allen, this is a simple matter of compromise. You retract your findings and our client will ensure your future is secure. You're asking me to lie. We're asking you to adapt. The truth is flexible, Professor. That's how the world works. The recording continued. The subtle threats, the veiled offers. At one point, the voice even mentioned friends in government who could make the professor's life uncomfortable if he refused. When the recording ended, no one spoke for a full 30 seconds. Even the reporters forgot to type. Finally, Judge Reynolds broke the silence. Mr. Cross, he said slowly, do you recognize any of the voices on this recording? Cross avoided eye contact. I'll need to confirm, Your Honor. You do that, the judge said coolly. But it seems this so-called scientific fraud might not be as straightforward as you claimed. The professor exhaled deeply, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. The judge looked at him, his tone softening. You've carried this burden for a long time, haven't you? The professor nodded. Every day, Your Honor. Every day since the truth was buried. As the proceedings continued, the prosecution's confidence began to crumble. Emails that were supposed to be missing appeared, each cross-referenced with financial transactions, showing donations from the investor's company to government accounts. Every file was another crack in the facade. Every fact peeled away another layer of corruption. By midday, the courtroom had transformed from a place of accusation into a battleground for truth. Cross finally snapped. This is a circus. None of this proves the defendant's innocence. At best, it shows irregularities. The professor lifted his tired eyes. Irregularities? You call bribery and blackmail irregularities? That's why truth doesn't survive in courtrooms anymore, because we've learned to rename evil. The room went silent again. Judge Reynolds's gaze lingered on the old man's trembling form. There was no arrogance there, no strategy, just a raw, painful honesty. After the lunch recess, Judge Reynolds called both parties to his chamber. Cross entered first, visibly agitated. Your Honor, if this goes public, it'll ruin more than reputations. You're talking about people in high office. The judge's expression didn't waver. Then perhaps they shouldn't have placed themselves above the law. Cross leaned forward, whispering fiercely. Do you realize what you're doing? You'll be finished after this. Reynolds's voice was quiet, almost too quiet. Then at least I'll be finished for the right reason. He turned to Professor Allen, who sat quietly in the corner, a hand pressed to his chest. Are you all right, Professor? The old man nodded faintly, though his breathing was shallow. Just tired, Your Honor. But I need to finish this. Then we'll finish it, the judge replied firmly, in open court. When they returned to the bench, the crowd had grown. Even people who weren't supposed to be in court, janitors, clerks, guards, stood near the door, listening. Professor Allen walked to the witness stand, the bailiff guiding him gently. Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth and nothing but the truth. I've been doing that my whole life, the professor said softly. He sat down and folded his hands. Professor, Judge Reynolds began, why didn't you come forward sooner with this recording? Allen looked down at his wrinkled hands. Because I believed the system would protect the truth. I believed in justice, until justice stopped believing in people like me. Cross interjected, Your Honor, with all due respect, this man's statements are emotional, not evidentiary. Sometimes, the professor interrupted gently, emotion is evidence of what's been lost. The judge let that linger before nodding. Proceed, Professor. Allen described in detail how his research had been twisted by corporations to delay environmental regulations. He told them about the anonymous threats, the funding cuts, the night he found his car vandalized outside his lab. He spoke not as a victim, but as a man trying to leave the world a little better than he found it. And yet, halfway through his testimony, his breathing grew heavier. His voice faltered. A hand went to his chest. Professor, are you okay? Judge Reynolds asked, concern flashing across his face. I'm fine, he whispered. Just one more minute. He steadied himself and looked directly at the prosecutor. You said yesterday that truth is flexible, Mr. Cross. But let me tell you something. Truth isn't clay. It's stone. You can bury it for a while, but eventually it resurfaces. The gallery erupted in quiet applause before the judge raised his gavel. Order. Please maintain decorum. But even Judge Reynolds couldn't hide the faint, proud smile tugging at his lips. As the court adjourned for the day, the professor began to gather his things. His assistant, a young woman named Claire, rushed to his side. You shouldn't push yourself like this, sir. You need rest, he gave her a weak smile. Rest comes later. Today I needed to speak. Judge Reynolds came down from the bench and approached him, something judges rarely did. Professor, your courage today reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. The old man nodded gratefully. Then perhaps justice isn't lost yet. The judge extended his hand and the professor took it with trembling fingers. Go home, the judge said gently. We'll reconvene tomorrow, and I promise you, and the truth won't be buried again. That night, heavy rain lashed against the courthouse windows. Judge Reynolds sat in his study, staring at the case files spread before him. He played the recording again, each word burning deeper into his conscience. He thought of all the cases he'd presided over, the ones he'd rushed, the ones he'd ignored. How many of them had carried a truth like this unheard? His phone rang. It was Claire, the professor's assistant. Her voice trembled. Your Honor. Professor Allen, he collapsed. He's at St. Mary's Hospital. The doctors say it was his heart. The judge stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. I'll be there in 10 minutes. When he arrived, the smell of antiseptic filled the air. Machines beeped softly. Claire sat by the hallway window, crying silently. The doctor approached quietly. I'm sorry, Judge Reynolds. He didn't make it. He passed peacefully a few minutes ago. For a long moment, the judge just stood there, frozen. Then he whispered, he was supposed to testify tomorrow. The doctor nodded. He did enough today, sir. More than most men do in a lifetime. Reynolds walked into the hospital room. The old man lay still, his glasses folded neatly on the bedside table. A faint smile rested on his lips, as if he'd finally found peace. Beside him was a sealed envelope addressed, To the court. The truth must be heard. The judge took it in trembling hands. The next morning, the courtroom was silent when Judge Reynolds entered. There was no professor this time, just an empty chair and the faint scent of old paper. He cleared his throat, voice heavy. Before we begin, it is my duty to inform the court that Professor Samuel Allen passed away last night. However, when he left behind his final testimony, he opened the envelope and began to read. If you are reading this, it means my heart has finally stopped fighting. But the truth, the one I've spent my life protecting, must not die with me. I forgive those who wronged me, because hatred only slows justice. But I pray this court remembers, science serves humanity, not profit. And truth, no matter how inconvenient, is the foundation of every civilization worth saving. The courtroom was silent, tears glistening in several eyes. Judge Reynolds took off his glasses, voice breaking slightly. May his words stand as testimony and as judgment on all who betrayed them. He banged the gavel once. This court finds Professor Samuel Allen not guilty of all charges. His name is cleared, permanently. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if by instinct, the entire courtroom rose to their feet, not in applause, but in silent respect. The verdict reverberated through the silent courtroom like thunder rolling across an empty valley. Not guilty. 2 simple words. Yet they carried the weight of a lifetime. Judge Reynolds' gavel struck the bench one last time, but it wasn't the sound of authority. It was the sound of redemption. The professor's empty chair stood like a ghost of what justice had cost, a reminder that truth, though victorious, often comes too late for those who fight hardest for it. The court adjourned, but no one left their seats. Even the reporters, who usually bolted to file their stories first, sat frozen. It wasn't a story anymore. It was a legacy. Later that evening, Judge Reynolds returned to his chambers, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. The air was thick, filled with the faint scent of old books and varnish. On his desk lay the professor's final letter, unfolded, its words echoing in his mind. Truth is not a weapon. It's a light. Use it wisely, even when it blinds. He sat down, rubbing his forehead. In all his years on the bench, he had prided himself on efficiency, getting through cases swiftly, keeping the docket clear. But the professor's death had pierced something in him that procedure could never heal. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo, him as a young attorney, standing beside his mentor, both smiling outside a courthouse. His mentor's voice came back to him now. The law is just ink on paper until someone suffers for it. And suffer the professor did, all because he believed in a truth bigger than himself. 2 days later, the courthouse steps were once again packed with journalists and cameras. Judge Reynolds stepped outside, not in his robes this time, but in a plain black suit. There was no script in his hand and no prepared statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but weary. "Yesterday, this court cleared the name of Professor Samuel Allen, a man who stood against lies that were too powerful for most of us to face." Cameras clicked rapidly. Reporters leaned forward. "But today," the judge continued, "it isn't just a man's name we must clear. It's our conscience." He paused, scanning the sea of faces. "For years, we've watched truth be bought and sold. Scientists silenced. Whistleblowers punished. Courts turned into tools for those with enough money to twist the facts. But Professor Allen reminded us what justice is supposed to look like." A hush spread across the crowd. He didn't have wealth. He didn't have influence, but he had something this country desperately needs: integrity. His voice trembled slightly as he added, "And because of him, I will be reopening every case in this district that was funded, influenced, or manipulated by those same corporations." Gasps filled the air. A reporter shouted, "Are you saying this court was compromised, Your Honor?" Judge Reynolds looked straight into the cameras. "I'm saying we stopped looking closely enough, and I won't make that mistake again." He stepped down from the podium and walked away, ignoring the barrage of questions. The sound of camera shutters followed him all the way to his car, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. A month later, a new law was proposed in the state Senate, the Allen Integrity Act. It demanded that all research trials, government-funded or private, undergo independent transparency reviews. It was small, perhaps symbolic, but it was the first ripple of something much larger. Meanwhile, a foundation had been created in the professor's name, funded not by corporations but by students and ordinary citizens. Its mission was simple: to protect those who protect the truth. Judge Reynolds was invited to speak at its opening ceremony. The hall was filled with scientists, students, and families. On the stage, beside the podium, hung a large portrait of Professor Allen, smiling, his eyes alive again through the brushstrokes. The judge adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "Samuel Allen once said truth doesn't need defenders. It only needs believers. But in a world like ours, belief is the hardest thing to keep." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "I sat in judgment of that man, thinking he was another fraud. But in truth, I was the one on trial. And when I look at his portrait now, I don't see a defendant. I see a teacher, and I'm still learning. The audience was silent, not out of formality, but reverence. That night after the ceremony, Judge Reynolds drove to the hilltop overlooking the city. The wind was cool, the stars sharp and clear. He parked the car, stepped out, and stood by the railing. The courthouse lights shimmered below, that same building that had broken and rebuilt his faith. He took the professor's final note from his pocket, now worn from being unfolded too many times, and whispered the words softly. Truth is not a weapon, it's a light. He folded it one last time and slipped it inside his breast pocket, close to his heart. Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps. Claire, the professor's assistant, approached quietly, carrying a small box. "I thought you might want this," she said. Inside was the professor's old fountain pen, the one he used to sign all his research papers. Reynolds smiled faintly. "He once told me he'd only use this pen to sign the truth." Claire nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "He'd be proud of what you've done." "No," the judge said softly, turning back toward the lights below. "I just finally listened." They stood there in silence, the city breathing softly beneath them. A fragile, imperfect world, but a little brighter now because one man refused to lie. Months later, in universities across the country, young scientists quoted Professor Allen in their research. His lectures, once scrubbed from public records, were uploaded online by students who refused to let his voice fade. And in the courthouse where it all began, a small bronze plaque was placed beside the witness stand. It read, "In honor of Professor Samuel Allen, who proved that truth, once spoken, can never truly die." Every day as Judge Reynolds passed that plaque, he'd pause him just for a moment and whisper quietly, "Thank you." And somewhere, in the echo of that old courtroom, perhaps the walls themselves whispered back, "Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper carried by those who refuse to let the truth disappear." Professor Allen may have left the world, but he left behind something far greater than innocence. He left behind belief, and belief, once awakened, becomes unstoppable. If you believe in truth, fairness, and the courage to speak even when your voice shakes, subscribe to Sweet Justice. Because here, every verdict has a heart, and every story carries a soul.